I don't know about you, but when I forget things, I usually remember them in just enough time to let it bother me. And I was reminded as I was sitting here with the children that I forgot to ask you how you were doing this morning so that you could tell me that you were blessed and highly favored. And I also forgot to thank Rita Arens and our brass ensemble for being with us today and for helping to lift our spirits in worship. And so thank you. Last week on Monday, I spent some time with our Jesus Walk group. And if you're not particularly familiar with the life of our church, our Jesus Walk is a group of adults with disabilities who have been meeting on Monday nights through the year for over 40 years now. And they have a varied program. And I'm usually fortunate enough to be invited to share their Monday evening on the week before Easter. And so once again, this year, I had the privilege of doing so. And one of the things that we did last Monday, as we often do when we're together on the week before Easter, we told together and reenacted together the story of Jesus from Palm Sunday to Easter, the last week of Jesus' life and then his resurrection at Easter. And last Monday, as I was enjoying that experience, I was reminded of something which strikes me every year at this time when I share in the Monday evening with the Jesus Walk members. And that is that those folks know the story of Jesus so well. And they know especially well the story of the last week of Jesus' life and of his resurrection. And not only do they know the contents of the story, not only do they know those events which took place during the last week of Jesus' life, they know its meaning. Without any prompting at all, they wrapped up our retelling and reenacting of the story by saying, that's why we're here. That's why we're here. The story of the last week of Jesus' life, and in particular of his resurrection at Easter, is why we are here. It's why his disciples told the story over and over again. It's why they wrote down those stories and compiled them into Gospels and into a New Testament. It's why they copied and preserved those stories. It's why the movement of Jesus' followers exploded in the first century and why it continues to exist and even to prosper today. It's why our forebears in this congregation and in other places like it around our city and across our country and even around our world have built beautiful structures like this and places in which to worship and to be reminded of the holy and of God's presence with us. It's why Christians are gathered all around the world today in different places and at different times to celebrate this story and the one who is risen. And as our Jesus Walk folks reminded me last Monday, it's why we are here. Just a few moments ago, Anne read so beautifully for us from the Gospel of Mark and Mark's telling of the Easter story. Some of those women who were part of the inner circle of people that were close to Jesus and believed in him and in his teaching and who supported him, went to the tomb at first light on that Easter Sunday morning, hoping to prepare his body properly for burial. You see, Jesus had died on a Friday afternoon, just a few hours before the beginning of the Sabbath, the day of rest, which would happen at sunset on Friday. That day of rest would carry on until the end of daylight on Saturday. And faithful Jews would undertake no activity during that time, no matter how important it was. And so in haste, his followers had put his body in the tomb, but they had not been able to prepare it properly for burial. Their first opportunity to do so was at first light on the first day of the week. The women went wondering how they would be able to roll away the heavy stone from the mouth of the tomb. To their surprise, they went and they found that in fact it had already been rolled away. They went inside and looked around to the right, and Mark tells us they saw a young man in bright white clothing who said to them, "You are looking for Jesus. He is not here. He is risen. Go and tell the disciples that he goes ahead of you to Galilee. And if you and they go there and meet him, he will be ready, and they will see him." Mark offers what to me is clearly an early and unrefined account of that first Easter. The story has not been changed to make the participants look good. The story is not told in such a way that the women who went to the empty tomb went away proclaiming boldly their newfound faith. No, they didn't really understand quite what had happened. And in fact, even though they had been asked to go and tell the disciples, they were too afraid to do so, and they didn't say anything to anyone. The story has not been changed to make the early Christian movement look good or even more reputable. As hard as it is perhaps for us to believe, in that time and in that place, the testimony and account of a woman was worth nothing. And yet the early Christians preserved the memory that in fact it was these women who were the first witnesses to the empty tomb and to the resurrection. The story of Mark and the others like it in the New Testament Gospels have not been explained. They have not been added to with extra description or to answer the questions that we may ask. Why and how? Nor has there been any sense of meaning deduced. We are left simply with Mark's conclusion. The women went away, and they did not tell anyone because they were afraid. It was not for years or even decades to come in the early Christian movement that the meaning of this event and of this day had been fleshed out to greater extent. And when it was finally done so, Christians came to understand and to proclaim the good news of Easter. And that is this: that God's promises are, after all, real and true. The creating and creative God is at work for new creation and new life in the midst of our world. And there is no one, nothing that can overcome or stop this incredible, creating, loving, life-giving power. Not so long ago, I got a phone call here at the church from someone in the community asking me to go and have a visit with her mother. And I went to their home, and I had a conversation with this person who was very near the end of her life. And she was dying of cancer. And the family had called me because the mother, who was very ill, was from another city. And in fact, she had a church home and a minister in this other city, but she had come to stay with her family at the very end of her life. And they somehow found our name and number and invited me to come and have a conversation. And I had the most wonderful talk with this woman about her life and her family and her experiences, and especially at this stage of her life, her anxieties and her fears. And as she reflected on the fact that the door was closing on this earthly life, she looked forward to a time beyond death where she would once again see her late husband and see Jesus face to face. In some sense, there was little left for her on this earth, and yet she found such joy in life because her hope is in the risen Lord, the one not found in that empty tomb at Easter, the one not there because he was risen. At this time of year, I love to recall the story of C.S. Lewis. Some of you have no doubt read some of the books of Lewis, particularly his novels, which are suitable even for young people, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and so on. Lewis was, in fact, by trade and profession, a University of Oxford professor in English literature, with an interest especially in medieval writings. Through his youth and young adulthood, Lewis was a committed atheist. He did not believe there was a God at all. And through his conversations at work and at leisure with colleagues such as Tolkien, whose name you may recognize, author of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, who was in fact a very devout Roman Catholic, Lewis came slowly to faith in God and to faith in the risen Jesus. In later years, Lewis wrote about the story of his own life, and he entitled that story "Surprised by Joy." And for him, that joyful surprise came through his faith in the risen Jesus. No matter how pleasant and even charmed his life had been at times, he discovered in the coming to Christian faith a joy which to that point he had not even known possible. Many of us have experienced in our lives times of hardship. We have experienced illness or seen the illness of those close to us. We have wrestled with thoughts of our own mortality or of that of our loved ones. We have experienced hardships of many kinds, and if we have not, likely we will soon. How will we handle those times and those situations? Certainly in our world there are many possibilities on offer. Different philosophies and worldviews and ways of life to consider. In my experience, there is one only in particular that can bring a confident hope and even a joy into our lives. A true joy which cannot be overcome or defeated. And that is belief and conviction that Jesus is risen from the dead, and a trust in him as our Savior and guide. There is one joy on offer to us, and that is Easter. There are many things that I cannot explain to you about it. But one thing I can say is this: that death is nothing to God, and therefore death is nothing to fear. May this wonderful good news bring us new life and joy, not only in eternity, but today.